For years, Canada-US tensions existed quietly in the background. Trade disputes would flare up, then cool down. NATO disagreements surfaced, then faded into diplomatic language. Nothing ever felt truly decisive. But in January 2026, something changed. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, U.S. President Donald Trump made a remark that instantly cut through decades of diplomatic caution. Speaking casually, he said that Canada lives because of the United States. At first glance, it sounded like one of Trump's familiar rhetorical jabs. But the timing mattered. The context mattered. And this time, Canada treated it not as rhetoric, but as a claim of hierarchy. Within days, Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, returned to Quebec City and responded publicly. He didn't mention Trump by name, but his message was unmistakable. He firmly stated, "Canada does not live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian." Canada, he said, does not exist at the pleasure of the United States. Canada thrives because of its own institutions, its own values, and its own people. Then came the line that echoed across diplomatic circles. We are masters in our own home. That sentence was not emotional, it was strategic, because behind it sat months of escalating tariffs, NATO pressure, and economic coercion. Davos wasn't the beginning of the conflict, it was the moment everything became visible. To understand what Carney is doing, you have to step back and look at the larger pattern. His approach isn't improvisation, it's a deliberate attempt to reposition Canada as a sovereign middle power in a world where economic integration itself has become a weapon. At Davos, Carney made a blunt observation that many leaders avoid saying out loud. The old idea that trade, finance, and security operate in neutral, rules-based systems is breaking down. Tariffs are no longer just trade tools. Supply chains are no longer just economic efficiency mechanisms. Finance is no longer apolitical. Major powers now weaponize all of it, openly. And in that environment, Carney argued, middle powers that pretend nothing has changed are the most vulnerable. The answer, in his view, is not isolation, but strategic autonomy, built collectively with other middle economies. This thinking explains why Canada has openly acknowledged something it once avoided admitting. Over-dependence on the U.S. market is now a risk. The United States remains Canada's largest trading partner, but since 2025, Canadian policymakers have faced unpredictable tariffs, national security justifications for trade actions, and policy reversals with little warning. Even when exemptions exist on paper, compliance has become more politicized and more fragile. As a result, Ottawa has accelerated export diversification toward Europe, Asia, and non-U.S. partners. This isn't anti-American, it's a hedge against volatility. At the same time, Canada has moved aggressively to strengthen its domestic production base. This is where the phrase, "bringing production back," often gets misunderstood. Canada is not trying to seal itself off, it's trying to make sure that critical industries don't collapse the moment external pressure increases. Since mid-2025, Ottawa has rolled out policies to reinforce steel, aluminum, lumber, and auto manufacturing. That includes protective measures against import surges, incentives to process Canadian raw materials inside Canada instead of exporting them at discounted prices, and support for domestic supply chains. The goal isn't protectionism, it's resilience. All of this policy thinking would still be theoretical if it weren't for what the United States actually did. The trade conflict is grounded in concrete tariff actions. On March 4, 2025, the U.S. imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian goods and 10% tariffs on energy products, including potash. The official justification was not trade imbalance, but enforcement pressure, including fentanyl-related claims. Then, on August 1, 2025, the general tariff rate was raised to 35%. Energy and potash stayed at 10%, but the signal was clear. Escalation was on the table. Technically, USMCA-compliant goods could still qualify for exemptions. In practice, compliance requirements became more stricter, slower, and far more political. Predictability, the foundation of trade, eroded. Steel and aluminum were hit next. On March 12, 2025, the U.S. imposed 25% tariffs under Section 232. By June 4th, those tariffs were raised to 50% and expanded to include derivative products. This directly struck Canada's industrial base, despite how deeply integrated North American manufacturing actually is. Autos followed. Between April and May 2025, the U.S. imposed 25% tariffs on automobiles and light trucks and 25% tariffs on non-USMCA-compliant auto parts. Partial exemptions for U.S. content existed, but the uncertainty alone disrupted supply chains that had been optimized over decades. In October 2025, lumber and wood products were targeted. Softwood lumber faced 10% tariffs, while furniture, cabinets, and vanities were hit with 25%. Higher rates planned for 2027 were delayed to 2027, but not canceled. The threat remains active. Canada's response was careful but unmistakable. In March 2025, Ottawa imposed counter-tariffs on $30 billion worth of U.S. goods. In the following months, additional 25% reciprocal tariffs were applied to steel, aluminum, and autos. By September 2025, many of these counter-tariffs were lifted, but not all. Steel, aluminum, and auto tariffs were deliberately retained as long as U.S. tariffs remained in place. Canada also initiated WTO consultations, fully aware of the organization's enforcement weaknesses, but unwilling to concede legality or principle. At home, Ottawa rolled out loan guarantees for exposed industries, anti-dumping measures to prevent market flooding, and freight subsidies to move Canadian materials across provinces. This was economic nationalism, but without isolation. Then came the political overlay, and this is where trade turned into something much bigger. Donald Trump's approach to NATO has long been transactional. He has repeatedly argued that the U.S. pays too much, that allies free ride, and commitments should be conditional. But in January 2026, his rhetoric escalated further. He claimed the U.S. never needed NATO allies and suggested that Allied forces were not on the front lines in Afghanistan. That claim was immediately contested, including by Canada. Canadian forces served in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2014, led combat operations in Kandahar, and suffered real casualties. These are NATO records, not interpretations. But the issue wasn't just factual accuracy, it was what the rhetoric implied. Trump's framing increasingly links security loyalty to economic treatment and political alignment to tariff exemptions. In effect, economic tools are being used alongside security language. That breaks a core post-Cold War assumption that NATO allies are exempt from economic coercion. This is why tariffs on Canada are not just trade measures, they are alliance-shaking acts. Carney's pushback operates on two levels. On facts, he rejects the rewriting of NATO history. On principle, he argues that security cooperation cannot be weaponized for economic gain. Tariffs against allies undermine trust, and NATO unity weakens when members are economically threatened. Rather than reacting defensively, Mark Carney is reframing Canada's role in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization by arguing that Canadian leverage is strategic, not just economic, because the Arctic is rapidly becoming NATO's most exposed frontier as ice loss opens northern approaches, shipping lanes, and infrastructure to military pressure. He has described the Arctic as a test for NATO and urged the alliance to prioritize securing its northern flank through faster defense investment. Rather than acting as a junior ally seeking U.S. protection, Carney highlights concrete capabilities, including expanded year-round Canadian military presence in the far north and over-the-horizon radar to detect long-range threats to North America. He explicitly links Arctic risk to state military threats, naming Russia and warning about missiles, submarines, long-range aircraft, and possible boots on the ice. Carney has also connected Arctic security to the Greenland controversy, publicly backing Denmark and Greenland as sovereignty principle, as a NATO principle. This framing supports a security provider posture, including consideration of limited Canadian troop participation in NATO exercises linked to Greenland. Overall, Carney's message is that if the Arctic is NATO's vulnerability,